Well, good evening to you all, and it's a very great pleasure for me this evening to welcome Annie Gray here to talk to this fantastic theme, A Greedy Queen, Queen Victoria and her food. I don't know if any of you were here on Monday to listen to Jeff Sachs talk about climate change, but there's a very nice, healthy contrast between Monday's lecture and tonight, and it's very good to come back to, I think, to the basic issues of food. For those who don't know, Annie is a writer, a broadcaster, and a consultant. She specializes in British food and dining from roughly, I like this, it's about several centuries, 1650 to 1950, small time period, and is resident food historian on BBC Two Radio's Force Kitchen Cabinet. She also advises on BBC and presents, of course, BBC Two's Victorian Bakers. Annie is a research associate also at the University of York, and her first book, A Greedy Queen, Eating and Drinking with Queen Victoria, was shortlisted for a Jane Grigson Trust Award for New Food Writing in March 2016, and this whole book is due for publication by Profile Books in May, and somewhere we've got the cover of it, which is, we've all got cards. Excellent, very good. So we are getting the message across. I was really enticed by the blurb for this lecture. Meet Victoria. She's a morbidly obese 78-year-old with an unhealthy relationship with food, forced by her hated mother onto a diet intended to impose discipline and control as a child, and used to taking refuge in food as a means of control. As an adult, she eats what she wants and as much as she wants, with the constitution of an ox and an appetite to match. I can't wait for more. So please join with me in welcoming Annie this evening.
Just going to lower this even more. Thank you. This is quite an exciting lecture for me to be giving because it's the first time that I've been able to talk about the research that I've done for the book. It's not a book talk per se, it's a talk about Queen Victoria and her food. I'm not going to read out chunks of the book to you or to extol the virtues of it and implore you to buy it, not least because you'd have to pre-order it and then you'd have forgotten about it by the time May rolls around. But hopefully I will titillate your appetite a bit and give you a new perspective on a monarch who I think we all know something about, even if we don't know a lot about. Victoria is very much in the news at the moment. I think she's one of those figures that is often somewhat pertinent in times of political turmoil in this country. We like to look back at a time that was settled, at a time when we all knew who we were, and when the lower sorts knew their place, and women knew their place too. And of course, as all of you know, that's rubbish. But it doesn't stop a real outpouring in the popular press of stuff about Victoria. How many of you saw the mini-series that was on last year? Satisfyingly few. I've not watched it, although I know quite a lot about it, strangely enough. There is a new film coming out later on this year. Judi Dench will be reprising her role as Victoria, looking at her relationship with Abdul Karim, known as the Munchie, one of her servants in her later years. So things about Victoria. Victoria is big. Victoria is in the press. And for once, Victoria is in the press as the young and beautiful queen. She wasn't that beautiful, that she was in the 1840s, rather than as the sort of black blob that she became known as. But we do all have our own visions of her. Here she is, 1838, diffident, sweet, slender, blue-eyed, always with her mouth slightly open, which was always slightly unflattering. Her half-sister said it always looked a little bit as if she was waiting for someone, and she should possibly look at shutting her mouth from time to time, because it was rather unflattering. And there she is, the slightly more, I think, familiar view to all of us. She lived a tremendously long life. She was, until last year, the year before last, the longest-lived monarch that we've had, the longest reign on the throne. She's somebody who defines Britain, not just to us, but especially abroad. And even if you go to France or Germany or any of the ex-colonies, if you see a silhouette of Victoria, it's not just us as Brits who might know who she is. She is a tremendously iconic figure. We quite like Victoria, I think. She speaks to us of femininity and domesticity. She seems a cosy figure, and yet I suspect even among the people here, you all have very different versions of Victoria. Snap poll, associations with Queen Victoria. If I say Queen Victoria, what springs to mind? Excellent. She never said it. Anything else? Empire, precisely. A huge thing and something we try and ignore, I think, in this country these days. Oh, let's just brush it under the carpet. British associations with foreign countries. We don't like that kind of thing anymore. Anything else? Terrible temper. Yeah, that's certainly true, especially in her old age. She is so many things to so many different people. Everyone has their own version of Victoria. There are over 200 books about her, and trying to find a new angle on someone who it appears sometimes everything has been said about can be quite difficult. When I set out to have a look at her, I wanted to do it through her food. And I've said this quite a few times to people who've gone, but Victoria didn't like food. I've never thought about Victoria and food. She had a 45-inch waist by the end of her life. This is not a woman who didn't like food. You don't get to be a black ball, as some people called her, unless you love your food. Who here's got a 45-inch waist? Pretty much no one. Who here's 5'1"? Excellent. Stand up. Stand up, those of us that are 5'1". I'm 5'2". You are not 5'1". Marvellous. This is Victoria's height, 5'1". Stand up anyone who's 5'10". Or 5'11". This is Albert's height. So there you go. Just to put it into perspective, Victoria's short, but she's not as short as people sometimes say. There's a curious set of myths about Victoria, myths that very quickly fall down when you start to investigate them. So in the recent mini-series, it was said that she was 4'9". Well, she may have been when she was 82, because people shrink in old age. But she certainly wasn't that when the previous picture to this was painted, because the tape measure exists that the painter used to measure her. And it's very clear she was 5'1". Of course, you can wear high heels and soup yourself up, but the fashion at the time was much more for flats, so she probably didn't. The Victorian Age is one of those that, again, everyone has different viewpoints of. It is an amazing period. Now, my heart firmly belongs in the Georgian period rather than the Victorian period, but there is no doubting that the age from 1837 to 1901 has a lot in it. And even those dates, by the way, are in dispute. We now have the long Victorian period, which might start in 1832 when the long 18th century ends, but it might start in 1821 when the Prince Regent finally becomes king, and yet it may not start then. It might start in 1830 when George IV dies. And although it might go on until 1901 when Victoria died, it might also go on until 1914 when a cataclysmic world event swept the entire of the globe, and therefore that age comes to an end, and certainly the food does. So if there's debate about the Victorian age, how much more debate will there be about what's in it? It is a tremendous period. It encompasses everything from fox hunting to clocks. It goes from electricity and gas in the kitchens, right from coal at the beginning. Gas lighting is in at the beginning, gas cooking comes in at the end. You have enormous misery, as always you do, among the working classes, deprivation, the hungry 40s when people are starving to death, food adulteration to the point that malnutrition 3-year-olds are dying because the bread that they are eating contains such bad stuff, watered down milk. And yet at the other end of the scale, you also have food colourings, and now you have petrochemical flavourings for your food. You have moulds to shape your food into anything you want it to look like. You have everything in this period, from tables that groan under the weight of meat to people whose diet is so reliant on potatoes and bread that they eat raw onions just to have something in their diet with some flavour. It is everything to everyone, and it's presided over by a woman who really could eat for England and did. To understand the Victorian period, it is worth having a brief nod at what came before. George IV, the Prince Regent, Prinny, the biggest glutton to have ever sat upon the English throne. He beat Henry VIII into a cocked hat with his appetites. And while revisionist history now places him as a patron of the arts and a man of exquisite taste, there is no doubt that he was loathed in his lifetime. I cannot imagine, I can imagine a world leader now being lamented in such words as the London Times used when George IV died. It said, "There was never an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king." So yeah, okay, fine, we can see the parallels in modern life. He was an inveterate voluptuary. That you wouldn't be able to say about Trump, who apparently lives on fast food and sleeps for 4 hours a day. George IV was hated. His brothers were hated. Creevey, who is one of the great political commentators at the time, said that they were millstones around Parliament's neck. These hated brothers, these wasteful sisters, all of them children of George III, all of them largely pointless. When you look in the 1830s, you see a procession of debauched, horrible old men who are lecherous, who are pretty nasty characters, and who all the revisionism in the world can't really paint in a good light. The Georgian period was messy, it was brutal, it was wonderful. The Victorian period, in popular mythology, is straight-laced, hypocritical, and puts women firmly in the house. All of these are broad brushstrokes, but there is no doubt there was a huge contrast in the periods. And above all of this sits our greedy queen. This is a banquet held at the Lord Mayor's residence, Mansion House in York, to celebrate the Queen's coronation. And it's one of the very few depictions of Victorian people eating. A lot of the time you have Victorian people at dinner, but they are not actually galumphing their food. And yet here you can see a man digging into the jellies. You can see enjoyment written on their faces. And there far away sits Victoria, staring at the jellies and, as it turns out, eating them with gusto. She's someone it's very hard to get to know, and I would argue impossible to get to know. After all, she's dead. And even during her own lifetime, she was something of a legend. This is the Duke of Windsor, later Edward VIII, who said, "So deeply had the power of Queen Victoria's personality pervaded the existence of her family that I can no longer differentiate with certainty between what I actually saw of her with my own eyes and what I later learnt from my parents or the courtiers who had served her, or what I learnt from books." Even in her lifetime, people couldn't decide what she was. And how can we dare to do that now? The truth, of course, is that she was human. She was many things at many times. She was a terrible mother, but she adored her children. She was an awful wife, but the love story between her and Albert is well known. She was a queen who had enormous power, real political power, and yet she was a constitutional monarch who could do nothing without her parliament. She's an enormously contrasting figure. But to me, obviously, she's a very greedy queen. So, to bare bones. Born in 1819, and if you look at her family at that point, you would not believe it. Not only are there all these debauched old men who are her uncles, but her own immediate family are pretty hideous too. Her father managed to get kicked out of the army for imposing discipline. His troops revolted against him and tried to cut his head off, believe it or not, before they were caught, and therefore he was demoted. He had to go away to Germany to marry a sort of broodmare mother in order to have Victoria, and then decided she needed to be born on English soil, so he rushed back to England, having pawned everything he owned and asked all of his friends for loans, to get back here so that Victoria could be born on English soil. The only reason he'd gone across and married a German broodmare, Victoria's mother, is because George IV's daughter, Charlotte, had died in childbirth in 1817. She was seen as a beautiful, sweet, virginal creature who would save us from the debauched Georgians and be a new Elizabeth. And when she died, all of the hideous brothers dumped their mistresses, found themselves wives, and tried to spawn, because they all wanted to be the father of the heir to the throne. And the Duke of Kent won. He won the battle. And then he died 4 months after Victoria was born, leaving her mother and Victoria stranded in the country with no money, because George IV wasn't going to give them any money because he couldn't stand her mother. But because the family is also hideously incestuous, Victoria's other uncle on her mother's side, who was married to Charlotte, the one who died, is still in England and manages to bankroll the whole family. And that's just a snippet of how weird their family is. They end up living at Kensington Palace, which is a sort of spare hotel, I suppose, for royals who are kind of not attached but vaguely attached to the family, infested with black beetles, hideous kitchens, drafty as hell, wet rot, dry rot, damp. It's absolutely appalling. Victoria later remembered Kensington Palace as just being either both infested with beetles but also hearing clocks ticking all the time, because one of the other mad uncles kept so many clocks in his apartment that that's all you could hear at Kensington. She looked back on her childhood and she hated it. It was tinted by what it became. As a child, she was breastfed, which was quite unusual at the time, and weaned, as was usual, onto sort of milk and bits of bread. She remembered not being allowed to drink tea except as a luxury, and she seems to have been kept on nursery food far longer than was necessarily the norm. There were carefully staged, managed appearances, like this one, which was published in the book in the 1840s, of the young Victoria with her lovely mother, she hated her, out in the garden with tea, little glimpses of this princess who was almost certainly going to become queen. There was a chance that one of the brothers, probably William, who became William IV afterwards, could yet have had a child to succeed instead of her. But the hopes of the nation were pinned on this little girl. And this little girl knew how to behave. She knew what queenship was from a very young age and bossed everyone about. She had a very odd upbringing. She had a beloved half-sister who was married off when she was only 9, Victoria rather than the sister. And after that, a thing called the Kensington System was put in place, which is fairly well known. It was a system designed to isolate Victoria and make her totally dependent on her mother and her mother's evil advisor, John Conroy. Now, there are lots of figures in history who are called evil. John Conroy seems to have actually been quite evil. There's no revisionist history that can make him out to be anything other than a fraudster and, as Victoria once said, a demon incarnate, which is kind of strong, really, when you think about it. She was paraded through the dining room, not every night, but certainly once she was sort of 11, 12. Her mother would hold big dinners, and the young Victoria would be paraded past all the jellies and ice creams and darioles and cakes, all of which we know about from the equipment list that exists for the kitchen, and then paraded back out again to go to the nursery and drink her milk and eat her bread. It was quite a schizophrenic existence from that point. And you find it gets worse. Because from the 1830s onwards, her mother decided she was definitely going to become queen and needed to be shown off to the nation. They went on royal progress across the country, which involved Victoria being shown to the great and the good, while her mother and Conroy schmoozed to try and get their way into the political circles of the time. Huge dinners were held in celebration of their arrival, not even with them present. Things like this. They held public dinners themselves as well. She went to so many cold collations that the journals that she's keeping at the time seem to be full of cold food with various males, all of them mayors, lots of pompous men surrounding her. She handled it with aplomb, but the diet did not agree with her. There are some fascinating doctor's notes from her time staying over in Wales, which show that she suffered from constipation and diarrhea, presumably not at the same time. She was fed rhubarb pills, which she hated, in order to try and flush her system through. And it's quite clear that the 15-year-old princess was suffering quite a lot from this strange food culture, where on the one extreme she was eating very plain nursery food, and on the other hand she was present at dinners which were catered for by the leading chefs of their day. If you were an aristocrat hosting the princess who would be queen, you would bring in the best. The chances are you already had your own French male chef cooking rich, beautiful food, foie gras and truffles by the gallon. Not least, and then you've got swans and not so much peacocks, but you've got woodcocks and blackcocks and everything you can imagine. Very meat-heavy diets, very, very rich. When Victoria could, she would escape, go to the kitchen gardens of wherever she was staying and gorge on fruit, which probably, to be fair, didn't help the diarrhea. Then she would run off to a dairy and gorge herself on butter and milk. It was quite clear she was developing a rather dysfunctional relationship with food, even by her mid-teens. She was described as gobbling. She was described as always eating too fast. Her half-sister recalled occasions where she would put salt into her gravy and mix it around with her knife unthinkingly before then eating it. She was told by good old Uncle Leopold, this one who'd supported them all the way through her childhood, that she should stop eating so much that she should try and restrain herself, that she should take exercise as well. These are all admissions which seem very, very modern. But it's quite clear that Victoria was in love with food and yet at the same time couldn't admit it. All the way through this period, she kept a journal, which she sort of used as a passive-aggressive form of communication with her mother. The mother read it, so Victoria would write brilliant things in it, such as, went on board a ship, ate some mutton chops. I really enjoyed them, but Mama was terribly sick. It's brilliant reading it, and when you realise that these are all coded messages intended for her mother, it gives you a real insight. It feels like a modern teenager. The pace, however, was terrible. Every year they were off on tour, and Victoria complained and complained and complained. Like any adolescent, she wanted to flex her muscles. She said she wasn't going on the final one up to York and got dragged there anyway, writing in her journal that she felt, and I quote, well tired. They got down to King's Lynn and the coach was unattached from the harnesses and the whole thing was dragged through the city. She hated every single second. And it took its toll. In 1835, she was extremely ill, possibly nervous exhaustion, possibly typhoid, possibly tonsillitis. No one really knows. It was thought for some time that she was possibly even dying. And just to show you how awful John Conroy was, that was the very moment he decided to try and get her to sign documents, making him into her private secretary. She refused, and after she recovered, it was war between them. She came out of her illness very, very determined to withstand everything. One of the other things about her illness is that when she recovered, for the very first time in her journals, she listed the food she ate. Now, given she was clearly something of a foodie and clearly eating too much when she could, it's very curious that in her journals she doesn't really mention much food. I read this as being that classic thing, if I don't think about it and I don't write about it, I won't get told off for something I know I'm doing wrong. But in the wake of her recovery, when she hasn't eaten much for about 2 weeks, suddenly the journals come alive with lists of everything she ate. 31st of October, took my luncheon at 12, which consisted of some potato soup. Took my dinner at 5, which consisted of soup, crème au riz, and some little bits of excellent mutton with boiled rice, which I relished very much. At 7, I had a glass of orange jelly with a Brussels biscuit, which I liked very much. The Brussels biscuits, which are a type of rusk, she loved for the rest of her life, and her chef, briefly, Charles Francatelli, published 2 recipes for them in his various cookbooks. She also, when she recovered, took great pride in the fact she'd lost weight. By this point, she was quite obsessed with what other people looked like, constantly writing in her journals about pretty people she'd seen, about the fact that so-and-so looked very thin. And when she did finally recover, she went on a diet which involved skipping lunch every single day that she could do. It was very, very obvious that now she decided to assert control, and she would assert it through the one thing that she could control, her food. She sketched herself, there she is, looking up at the camera like the average selfie today on Instagram. And she even said in her diary, I am growing very thin and a little taller. And Dr. Clark says I shall grow quite tall after this. I think that was wishful thinking, but both she and her uncle were adamant that if she tried, she'd be able to grow a bit. Yeah, right. Anyway. Matters came to a head in 1836 when there was a birthday dinner held by her other uncle, William IV, who by now was on the throne, and who absolutely hated her mother. At his birthday dinner in August 36, there was a terrible, terrible scene, which, quite frankly, you wouldn't believe if you saw it in some form of drama or soap on TV. William, who was quite drunk at the time, stood up and shouted at Victoria's mother that she was incompetent, unfit to be a regent, and she was overheld by evil advisors. It wasn't what I would call a sort of easy, tactful birthday dinner. Victoria didn't mention it in her journal, but all the courtiers, as you can imagine, were agog. William decided he needed to live long enough that Victoria would turn 18 and accede to the throne in her own right, something which seemed a little bit dubious at the time as William was showing signs of age. One of the most touching parts for me in researching this book was the bit where I was looking at the dining ledgers at Windsor Castle for 1837. Because William did manage to outlive Victoria's 18th birthday, he managed to live just a month after she turned 18. And when you're reading the dining ledgers for that period, trying to work out what the meals were like at Windsor Castle in the last few months of William IV's reign, you suddenly realise that you're watching a man die through his menus. It's really odd. You've got full menus, sort of, I don't know, there are 2 courses, but there are sort of 30, 40 dishes listed. And this goes on for day after day after day. It's quite monotonous. There's an awful lot of hare soup going on. And you're reading it, and then all of a sudden, the king's menu appears in a separate column. Barley soup, chicken rice, classic invalid food. And you think, oh, the king's ill. And you keep reading because you haven't really clocked what's going on at this point. And you go through, and the king is on this sort of unrelenting diet of chicken souffle and barley soup and beef tea. And then all of a sudden, he disappears. Completely disappears. 2 days after the Archbishop of Canterbury appears at dinner, clearly to administer the last rites. And the day after the king dies, it's no longer listed as their Majesty's dinners, but just dinners at Windsor, and they have a severely cut-down menu. For Victoria, it meant freedom, and as the last rites were administered to William IV, she couldn't wait to get her hands on queenship. She mourned her uncle, but she'd barely known him, and now she got to be in charge of Buckingham Palace. It was amazing. She had Windsor too, but, that was kind of donkey's years old, and also Queen Adelaide was living there. So she said, well, hang on to it for a month. I want Buckingham Palace. Now, Buckingham Palace at the time was a building site. It hadn't been finished. It was pretty awful. It smelt of glue. It was garish because it was George IV's taste, so it's basically bright pink with gold all over it. It was pretty nasty, but it was ideal for an 18-year-old who had a love of gold and wanted bling in everything. Plus, it was enormous. So she could stable her mother at one end of the palace and herself at the other. Her mother refused to move out, absolutely refused steadfastly to go anywhere until Victoria got married, which Victoria had absolutely no intention of doing whatsoever because she was queen now, and that meant she could go partying. And party she did. She threw herself into it. All of this gold and bling, that was her. That was she wanted. Buckingham Palace was very hastily refitted. They managed to find a throne for her. That's all she wanted. They said, there's no carpets or beds. She said, don't worry, I don't need carpets and beds, but I do want a throne. So they supplied a throne, and she got her throne, and that was fine. And it largely worked, and I say it largely worked. The problem with the royal palaces was that they looked good. I mean, you've got the Waterloo Gallery. That's absolutely gorgeous. They renamed it, incidentally, every time the French king visited. You've got Windsor. It looks very nice, although clearly there's building work still going on. Buckingham Palace is hideous. But it all looks royal, doesn't it? I mean, you'd be forgiven for walking past today, Windsor Castle or Buckingham Palace, and just assuming that if it's royal, it works. But then you might make the same assumption about Victoria's family, and they certainly didn't work. Buckingham Palace was a nightmare, and it was one of the most shocking things, actually, in the research, was reading the accounts of exactly what was going on there. London itself was a growing issue. You've all heard, I'm assuming, about cholera outbreaks and the great smogs and all that kind of thing, coal fires, open running water with sewage running into it. All of this stuff affected the poor, though, surely. It wasn't a problem if you were royal. Kind of. I mean, Buckingham Palace had security issues, so there were tramps regularly found in the grounds. Sometimes people broke in and tried to propose marriage. One boy broke in 3 times, eventually got transported to Australia for his pains. But the worst thing, or 2 of the worst things, one was the administration. Nothing got done. So if you wanted a window fixing, then you had to call up the window fixing department, and that was fine. They would sign a chitty. But then the window fixing department had to go and find another department to come and actually fix the window, so it never got done. Windows were cleaned on the inside, but never on the outside, because 2 different departments were liable for it. In the kitchens, even, if you wanted a new pot, 3 different people had to sign off on it. And if you wanted a fire lit, forget it. One department laid the fire, another department was responsible for lighting the fires, so the place was freezing. Windsor was especially known for its poor administration and seemed to swallow dusters at a rate of knots as well, which is one of the strangest things that you find. Buckingham Palace had a bigger problem, though, and the problem related to the kitchens. The kitchens had never been properly finished, so a lot of the rooms that you would expect to find with kitchens didn't exist. You had the main kitchen, but things like larders and sculleries and roasting kitchens and vegetable kitchens, they were a bit lacking. Instead, there was a room full of urinals and open dustbins next to the main kitchen. That's fine, it just smelt a bit. I mean, everyone can cope with a bit of man-wee smell when they're cooking their foie gras, can't they? Not a problem. But it got worse, because the kitchen, when built, had been built in a hurry by John Nash, and he'd discovered, as he built the foundations, that there was a really handy brick floor underneath. And he thought, great, I've just dug down and found a brick floor. Marvellous. I will build the kitchen on top of this handy foundation. It was a sewer. The main sewer for the entire area. The great conduit, in fact. And the bricks were porous. So every time it rained, poo came up through the brickwork. And the walls of the kitchen were about a foot deep in human effluvia. It got worse as well, because Buckingham Palace itself didn't have any decent sewage. So while you got plebeian turds coming up through the kitchen floor, you had royal poo going up through everybody else's floorboards. And believe it or not, people didn't really like that. They said that Buckingham Palace was bringing the area down. The ladies-in-waiting complained as well, because every time you opened a window, everything would go black inside the palace. So you got the smells of cooking, the smell of urine, the smell of glue, all working its way through the palace, and then you opened a window, and opposite was a street called Prince's Court, whereupon one commentator said, the emanations drawn into the palace were so powerful as to produce nausea and feelings of sickness when we went close to the sinks. That's downstairs. Upstairs, when you open the window, the area opposite was used as a urinal for everybody in the area. So all of those fumes would waft into the palace and turn all of the brass black overnight. And the walls, which were once white, went black as well. The ladies-in-waiting blamed the local gasworks, but no, it was just man-wee. Just imagine, great place to work, no ventilation, charcoal chafing stoves in the kitchen, cooks dying of respiratory failure, and they're working with poo up the walls. I cannot really overemphasise how scuzzy it was. Victoria didn't care, she just ate the food. The main kitchen in any case was at Windsor, and Windsor Castle kitchens are still justifiably famous. They acted as a kind of culinary hub for the whole reign. So a lot of the food that was produced in these kitchens was sent off to Victoria wherever she was, and parcels of mainly cakes and breads and baked goods were often sent off when she was at different palaces. They were and are really quite stunning. Has anyone visited the Windsor Castle kitchens? They're amazing, aren't they? You walk in and your jaw drops. Gabrielle Schumi, who was an apprentice in the 1890s, said that the main kitchen looked like a chapel with its high-domed ceiling, its feeling of airiness and light, and the gleam of copper, well-worn and burnished at each end of the room. Their origins were medieval, so if you go into the kitchens here in Durham and you see those wonderful fireplaces, kind of a bit like that, but 5 times bigger. They had been redone by George IV, the famous gourmand, in 1828, so they didn't really need updating for most of Victoria's reign. This is them in 1840, 1860, 1870, 1880 and 1890, because the Illustrated London News just used the same picture every single year. And you can see in them, you've got gas lighting, you've got these that used to be the roasting ranges, similar to the ones that you've seen here, but by this point are filled with charcoal chafing stoves. You've got an enormous roasting range at the back behind this screen, which, by the way, has its own battlements, because why wouldn't you have a roasting screen with battlements? The roasting screen was a big wooden thing with doors in, as you can see with this man here moving them, and behind it is the roasting fire. Up here above it was the roasting spit, and that was turned automatically, so the heat of the fire would draw so much air out the room that drawer would turn a fan, which in turn would turn the spits. So everything was fully automated. There were brakes on it to stop it. There was also a smaller fire just for the Queen's own roast meats. The chafing stoves were charcoal-fired, so these ones were fairly well ventilated. They didn't kill off too many cooks, but they did need constant care and attention. And this table in the middle was a steam-heated table. So elsewhere in the kitchen complex was a huge boiler room, and that pumped hot water all the way around the kitchen, so this table was steam heated all the time. These smaller tables were where the master chefs worked. There was a head cook in charge of the whole thing, 4 master cooks under him, and then a staff of around 35 people under him. And as you can see in this picture, most of them were men. There was a staff of around, as I say, 35 to 45 cooks, about 70 people in total if you include the various silver pantry staff and the butlers and all those kind of butlery, rather. And about 15 of them at any one time were women. 8 out of the 35 cooks were women in 1900. If you were a woman, it wasn't even a glass ceiling, it was concrete. There was absolutely, you couldn't even see through it. You were just there. You join as a kitchen maid, you might have 2 steps on the ladder. If you were a man, You could go wherever you wanted to. A lot of people joined the kitchen as apprentices and stayed there, making eventually yeomen of the kitchen or master cooks. The titles are pleasingly weird. There even is at one point a boy of the kitchen, although by this point it's gone. Over here you've got William Cullen, who was the master clerk, and this is a man called Georges de Saul. George, like so many people in the kitchens, was the son of somebody else working in the establishment. It's totally nepotistic. And he was the son of a page of a presence. He joined and worked his way up from apprentice. Very few people left. Sometimes they did, sometimes they died. Quite a lot of them died, in fact, normally of respiratory failure. One man died of fits. He'd been having fits for at least 2 years while working in the royal kitchens before he then retired and then died. One woman had appalling liver failure, which would have been incredibly painful before she too died in service. But by and large, people stayed. Some people did get sacked. Charles Francatelli, who was quite a well-known chef of his day, cooked at Crockford's and eventually the Reform Club, joined the kitchens in the 1840s and got sacked after a fracas in the kitchen, during which a policeman was called and he had to escape out of a window. Some left and started up their own businesses as well, especially the confectioners, who were very, very skilled individuals. One called Giuseppe Califano ran an ice cream parlour in Eton many years afterwards, to which the boys would apparently go and then not talk to him because he was scary and they all thought he'd been sacked and would chase them down the street with a knife. He didn't get sacked, he left. All the records are still there. The wages were all right. They weren't as good as you would earn if you were cooking for a hotel or a club. If you were in a hotel or a club, you might earn £1,000 a year. Obviously, you're a man. If you were cooking in a private establishment, you might earn £150 to £200 a year. This is as chief cook. If you cooked at Windsor, then you would earn about £250 to £300 a year. And that didn't really change. There wasn't much inflation during this period. You'd also get apartments at St James's Palace. And you had the right to come to work in a top hat. And you got perks as well. You got apprenticeship fees and various other things as well. If you were a woman, you might aspire to earn £40 a year. That's as much as you could manage it. But there were benefits. Working in the royal kitchens enabled you to gain access after 10 years of service to a pension, something that was exceedingly rare at that point. You also got sick pay, the Queen's bounty, which continued well into the 90s, if not the early 2000s, and was a sort of elective bounty that you could have if you were sick. One of my favourite characters that I found when researching the book was a woman called Jane Elgar, who was a confectioner's maid. She joined the kitchens when she was 17 in 1828, so only about 10 years after the first women even started in the royal kitchens, and she was there for her entire life. She retired at 67 with a pension to Kent. She had outlasted 5 heads of department above her, and she'd earned the same wage for about 60 years. £40 a year for the entire time. Good on Jane Elgar, I say. She could have left, but as a woman in Victorian Britain, I say she was better off staying where she was. Supplying the palace, as you can imagine, was enormous. The number of people fed. We tend to think of palace food and we think of the Queen. But these kitchens were feeding anything between 3,000 and 15,000 people on the average month, sometimes even several thousand people a day. And the meals on the top table could consist of anything between 12 to 30 dishes, and balls could consist of anything up to 200 or 300 dishes, sometimes repeated along the table. When you look at the statistics of what went into the kitchens, you realise this is not finesse. This is not a nice restaurant environment. This is mass catering. J. Armfield was one of the main suppliers of meat, and in the first 2 weeks of Victoria's reign, he supplied 4,000 pounds of beef, 2,500 pounds of mutton, 2,000 pounds of veal, 400 pounds of lamb, 200 pounds of suet, 36 calves' livers, 3 calves' heads, 204 calves' feet, 28 sweetbreads, 12 lamb's feet, 7 quarters of lamb, 10 lamb necks, 3 oxtails, and 4 calves' brains. The brains, clearly, were for top table. The beef went below. The meals were staggering, and there are dining ledgers from the period which show very much that there's not just 3 or 4 meals being cooked. It's not just servants, upper servants, queen. There is a huge, almost infinite number of different tables, and rank within this household, status, was incredibly important. Victoria put on quite a lot of weight. In her first year, she managed to get herself up to 9.5 stone, which she decided was incredibly fat for someone of 5'1", so she went on a diet and got down to 7 stone 2. That gives her a BMI of 18.8 for anyone who's interested in such things. She is right at the bottom of where you should be if you're healthy, and clearly verged on what today we would regard as exceedingly thin. She was incredibly worried she was going to be a fat Hanoverian, and she was encouraged in that thought by Lord Melbourne, her first Prime Minister. But what it did mean was that when she got married, she was tiny. This is her wedding dress that you can see over here. The marriage was thorny. Victoria in 1837 to 1839 was a party animal. She loved going to balls, getting drunk, staying up till 5 in the morning, getting up early, then not really getting up early but staying in bed till late, then feeling guilty about all the stuff she hadn't done, then going to another ball, getting drunk. We've all been there, I feel, that sort of cycle of hangovers and stuff. Anyway, she got bored, very, very bored, and the nation was starting to get a bit sick of her. She looked like she was going to be fun and sweet, but she was 18 and really naive and frankly didn't know her job. And she was so bored that when Albert turned up, she fell completely in love. I mean, I'm not suggesting that she didn't genuinely love him later on, but the marriage was very much engineered by her mother and Uncle Leopold, and on paper they were not suited at all. When she'd first met Albert at her 17th birthday party, he'd been too weak and feeble to make the dinner, fainted halfway through the first dinner, couldn't come to the party afterwards, and generally spent the entire trip being a complete and utter wuss. He probably had Crohn's disease, which didn't exactly make him a foodie. So you've got on the one hand someone who wants to get drunk, party, and have, as she put it, a great deal of dissipation, and on the other hand, a man who doesn't like eating and regards food as simply sustenance. But they got married, and it was lovely, and everybody hated him because he was a German, and we don't like people who are not British, do we? Apparently. And you all know what follows: 9 children. She did not put on significant amounts of weight during the marriage, and it does genuinely appear that Albert, quote-unquote, tamed her. Now, I have grave reservations about this whole idea of him taming her. She herself said later in life that meeting and marrying Albert meant that she calmed down, that she became the woman she was supposed to be. For goodness sake, she was 19 and having a good time. Did she need taming? She thought in later life she did. She grew increasingly close to Albert and Albert's views. He did not like Buckingham Palace. He did not like London living. He didn't even particularly like Windsor. And even she complained that Windsor was beautiful and comfortable, but a palace. And God knows how willingly I would always live with my beloved Albert and our children in the quiet and retirement of private life, and not always be the constant object of observations and newspaper articles. Celebrity status, alive and well and living in the 1850s. Anyway, moving on from the picture of miserable Victorians, she did get her way. She went over to France in the 1840s, early 1840s, and fell in love with the idea of a private palace, like Louis Philippe's Chateau d'Eu. And so she bought, and she and Albert did up, well, mainly Albert, Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. This view is of the kitchens. So here they are. They are now garages, and all of this is garage doors. But the kitchens are in this block here and wrapped around. There they took a skeleton staff, 7 or 8 cooks with them, and they lived in the way a private middle-class family would, except, obviously, for the massive amounts of servants and the 2 massive apartment blocks. All of this is for servants and courtiers, and obviously the politicians. But, you know, if you gloss over that, their meals certainly were more subdued. They ate often only 3 or 4 courses, well, 6, and they ate as a private family. Sometimes the children came and ate with them, and it was very obvious that this was a house about children. One of the nicest things about it is the way in which Victoria sought to sort of get over and to make up for her own hideous childhood by having for her children a completely different setup. This is Swiss Cottage, which some of you might be familiar with, and that's the kitchen on the inside, which apparently is 3/4 sized. It's the perfect height for me. This was set up so the children could learn to cook. This was royal prince. It's not completely unusual for royal princes and princesses at this point in time to have a play kitchen and a play house. But the royal kids would go down there, cook their own afternoon tea or lunch, growing their own vegetables, and they would cook in the kitchen. And there seems to have been no form of gendering either. It wasn't girls in the kitchen, boys in the garden. Girls and boys all had their own plots, and they all seemed to cook. And Victoria would go down there with Albert, and they'd have a children's tea party, and then they'd dig the governess out from the fort where the children had locked her. and generally have an absolutely splendid time. And Swiss Cottage remained in use by Victoria's children and her grandchildren until well into the 1870s, at which point it started to become more of a private tea-taking house for the Queen herself. It was quite convenient because it had a loo, so she could stop when she was in the grounds and find tea. She did a lot of finding tea. It ignores the fact someone had to make it, clearly. They also decided to build Balmoral, which was more about hunting anything that moved, really. Albert at one point wanted to dig trenches so that he could shoot the deer and they couldn't see him, but that was regarded as very un-British and vetoed. But nevertheless, dead things, especially venison, was a huge part of what Balmoral was about. And again, the children were involved, so they were encouraged to go out and learn to spear salmon in the river, to go out and to butcher deer, to kill the birds. It was all brilliant. This was an orgy of death. Massive great game larder. And Victoria also, along with Albert, adapted at this point the habit of tramping out incognito around the countryside. I don't know how incognito you can be when you turn up in a carriage with a royal crest on it. But apparently everybody helped. She was delighted. She always thought she was unrecognised in the inns she went to, and it often led to her having some terrible dinners. On one occasion, she noted that the wine was awful, so it was good they'd brought their own, and there was no pudding and no fun. She clearly hadn't given up on her love of food, but she didn't, as I say, put on weight. She did develop a taste for whiskey from living in the Highlands as well. Begg's Distillery, which was on the Balmoral estate, very cleverly invited her and Albert out to come and see the distillery. And Albert, as a scientific man, was really interested in the process of distilling. And Victoria was really interested in the results. And after that, Begg's Best was always on the menu wherever they went. On one occasion, she notoriously added whiskey to her claret, which, if that appalls you, don't be appalled, try it. Don't try it before you have to do anything, but do try it because it is surprisingly good and I think gives you quite an interesting perspective on the Queen. It is lethal, but it tastes fabulous. She was blissfully happy, at least in retrospect. In reality, she and Albert were having enormous rows. He still couldn't digest anything, and he took advantage of every trip he took to Germany alone to go on a fasting diet where he just used to drink chamomile tea and take lemon in water. But it's very, very clear that most of the time their marriage was about as harmonious as the average marriage often is. And as you can see from this picture taken in 1861, she really is fairly trim still, as well as besotted. Albert, on the other hand, looks increasingly florid and unpleasant. The British nation had vaguely taken him to heart, mainly because of the Great Exhibition and the fact that he was doing an awful lot to promote the cause of British farming at the time, heavily involved in both agricultural improvement, but also in improving the lot of especially the rural poor. This is from Punch. There's Albert and his Victoria milking a cow. Never happened, but it is rather cool, I think. Doom! Doom! This is a scene that never happened as well. This is great. This is from one of the sort of florid magazines. Unfortunately, none of the children were there, apart from Beatrice at the time. There are stripy people. There's a very beautiful-looking queen. There are small children. There's no Kaiser cradling the queen. Sorry, he's not there at that point. There's no sort of... There were a lot of bishops present at Albert's death, muttering prayers. It was all very long, drawn out and nasty, and Queen Victoria blamed her eldest son, Bertie, for his death because Bertie had got himself mixed up in a sexual scandal, and Albert, being rather prurient, had rushed over to go and try and sort him out. It was all rather torrid and rather unnecessary, and current theory is that Albert actually died from complications of Crohn's disease, probably pneumonia, and that he probably had a stomach ulcer. But Victoria decided he had typhoid, just as she has had in 1835, so they were one and the same. And she threw herself into depression. She was properly depressed in a clinical and very hardcore way. She had some form of nervous breakdown, couldn't move, she lost the use of her legs for several months. And the same when John Brown died as well, she couldn't walk after that as well. And there is no doubt this floored her completely. But she also threw herself back into her first love, and she threw herself into eating. I do not believe that she had a torrid affair with John Brown or the Munchie or any of the other men in her life, but she had two big loves, Albert and food, and with one gone, she went for the other. She said later of Albert that she did nothing, moved not a finger, arranged not a print or a photograph, and didn't put on a gown or a bonnet if he didn't approve it. That is how she felt that she had been with him. If any of you are familiar with the 2016 definition of abuse, domestic abuse, it's very, very close. It's not true. It's very, very clear from reading her journals and the words of the people around her that she was still having enormous rows with him, that he was still dedicated to work. He was far too busy doing his own stuff to tell her whether or not he liked her hat. And also, she had terrible clothing sense. So to be honest, he probably would have been better than her and she wouldn't have worn such terrible clothing if he had actually bothered to admit an opinion. But she was prepared to abrogate herself to his memory in such a way that she really did become subject to what he had been, never mind, or in her memory what he had been, never mind what he actually was. The breakdown led to her putting on weight, and already by 1863 she was described as growing enormously fat. She really did replace sex, which she adored, with food, which she adored even more. And this picture she loved because she said it had a total honesty about it, a lack of flattery, she said. It's not good, is it? I mean, she's not a pretty woman, it must be said. One of the things that did change as she moved out of the deepest phase of mourning was that she did discover other things to do. And those things were holidays. One of the biggest associations with Victoria is the Riviera and the holidays that she took towards the end of her life. And you can easily divide her life into phases. Childhood, the years before she got married when she was partying, the years when she was married and fairly stable, the deepest phase of mourning, and then that bit where she came out of it. And where she did things which, by her own admission, she felt guilty about doing because Albert was not there to share them with her. On her deathbed, she said that she did feel a little bit nervous about meeting Albert because she'd done a great number of things that she felt he wouldn't approve of. And that included partying like a beast on the French Riviera. The first holiday she went on was to Lucerne in Switzerland, and she went there specifically because Albert had been there before he'd met her, so she felt that she was following in his footsteps. And her journals at the time are full of the fact that she tramped up mountains. She was constantly hot, always travelled everywhere with ice. So she was tramping up and up and up, further up mountains, as far up as possible, to find somewhere that was icy. And then she'd have tea and pick wild berries and eat them and then have tarts made out of them. She brought her own chef with her to Lucerne, and they also employed local chefs who were taught to make English sandwiches. One Swiss newspaper said they were actually very good if you got used to them. She was indefatigable. She tramped out in all weathers. This is an illustrated London News picture, which is not particularly brilliant reproduction, but you can see the tea set up here, and there she is in her carriage being given her tea. She attended the Fête des Gorges, the Fête des Cogodons, as it was called in Nice, where they were painting gourds in bright colours, often with her face on them. She sat down to enormous lunches while she was in Nice, and she went off in all weathers, coming back covered in dust. She climbed up La Grande Chartreuse when she was in Aix at one point, and when they offered her some refreshments and brought her tea, she refused it, saying she'd only really come for the Chartreuse spirit that she knew they made. She commented it was quite strong. It was a very unbalanced lifestyle. Anybody in the public eye has an unbalanced lifestyle, but Victoria's was worse than most. At this point, if she was taking meals in private or with her ladies, as she often did, she would have a fairly cut-down version of the enormous menus that she would have had when she was younger, something perhaps fairly light, like just 6 courses and loads of mutton. But she would also host state visits. This is the Tsar of Russia, his wife, and the Grand Duchess Elgar, who was shot in 1917 in a basement. I know, it brings it all alive, doesn't it, when you see them in tinted colour and you suddenly realise what happened to them. Here again at Windsor with the great buffet on display, a massive state ball. And this, you can see there's various foreign dignitaries meeting Victoria. At state banquets, the food was incredible. Bustards, which had been hunted to extinction in Britain well before she was eating them. Larded hare's kidneys. I mean, larded hare's kidneys. Larding means sewing strips of bacon through the flesh of a beast. A hare's kidney's not very big. How do you lard it? The delicacy of that process must be absolutely incredible. Turtle soup coming out of their ears, champagne jelly, pineapple jelly, poached apricots, lamb's feet, vol au vents, grouse. If it moved, they ate it. If it grew, they ate it. But never in plain ways, always in elaborate ways. It could be very fraught. When the Shah of Persia visited, rumour went round the whole of Europe as he moved around that he was lecherous. that he would put his arm on the back of the Queen's chair, that he would eat his dinner and throw the bones underneath the chair, and worse still, that he needed a live lamb to sacrifice to the rising sun. It was very disappointing when he visited. He ate lots of fruit and didn't drink any wine and was rather shocked at the fact that Victoria's sons were wearing kilts. And he didn't throw chicken bones under the chair at all, although in the menu books it's clear he was having live lambs brought in. Did he sacrifice them? Probably not. They were probably just butchered in a halal manner for his followers. But there we go. On a day-to-day basis, well, Victoria's meals were large. It's a more physical age, and she's a very physical person. Her breakfast was usually mutton chops, sausages, and a beefsteak. 1875, you've got 4 people. For breakfast, they had sausages with potatoes, grilled whiting, poached eggs in stock, hot and cold roast fowl, and bread and porridge. So, reasonable. You're not going to eat it all, but you are going to eat a fair amount of it. You are not encouraging waste in this scenario. Your luncheon was relatively small, often made of leftover dishes, usually served à la française, everything on the table at once. In your dinner, well, à la française was the service style early in the reign, so 2 courses, lots and lots of dishes on the table at once, moving to à la russe, a sequential linear service in around 1874. There were muted dinners, so June 1857, there were just 3 of them. They only had soup with poached eggs, a clear chicken soup, a sole gratin, fried whitings, roast beef and capon with asparagus, vol au vent with bechamel sauce, grilled eggs, apricot flan and waffles. It's virtually nothing, isn't it? This is a page from a ledger. You can see from 1897, and here you can see this is the royal dinner, the household dinner, so the upper servants, and the number of people and who they are. You've got a royal luncheon, and then you've got spread out across the pages, as I mentioned, all those various groups, which could be as few as 1 person. Mr. Fraser, who was one of the Highland servants, just had his own dinner because he was a status all of his own. And the food could be spectacular. Didn't have to be. But could be, and often also spectacular in a way that we would not imagine. This, for example, is a lamb's head curry, where you take the ears and poach them and then stuff them and fan them, and you take the brains and make them into croquettes, and you take the meat. And you know what? I'm not selling it. Man cutting off a turtle's head, perhaps a bit better. If you wanted turtle soup, which was often eaten at big state occasions, you'd import a live turtle from the West Indies, chop its head off, hang it up overnight, use the green fat and use the flesh to make 2 different dishes, and often serve it in the turtle shell as well. There's your plain jellies. Birds always served, as you can see, head, legs on, pancakes, jellies, there's a blancmange. This one is a particularly good Victorian dish. That one is Jerusalem artichokes and Brussels sprouts with a rice border, so excellent with corsets. It's going to hurt, that, isn't it? The food looked great, it tasted great. Victorian foods had a really bad reputation for stodge, suet pudding. I don't understand why suet pudding is seen as stodge. Suet pudding is one of the best things this country's ever invented. I mean, quite frankly, a good suet pudding is unbeatable. And good for you, because we all know now that fat's good for you, don't we? Sugar's bad, fat's good. Fine, it'll be different next year. Anyway, but just imagine sitting down to a meal where this is a fraction, a quarter of the dishes on offer. The point wouldn't be that you would eat all of the dishes, incidentally, whether it was served all on the table at once or whether it was sequential, you could pick and choose to some extent. But the meals were large, and Victoria could put away 9 courses in half an hour. So her gobbling habit that she had when she was younger was certainly still a feature of her older age. She could, if she wanted to, slow down. A later state visitor said the meal took 2.5 hours, and the Queen ate of everything that was on offer, including the hot and cold puddings, and all of the meats, and all of the vegetables, and everything. But half an hour is what she could do, and she would use that as a way of disciplining her courtiers. Let's face it, if you're eating with the Queen, when she finishes a dish, it's off. So if you don't eat at the same pace she does, you don't eat. And courtiers complained time and time again that eating with the Queen was a horrible experience, because if they wanted to have conversation, then they couldn't eat. And if they wanted to eat, they didn't have time for conversation. As she grew older, one of the really obvious features of her life is the fact that she remains excited by food. She was not, as many people say, an invalid from early on. I think we have a vision of Victoria which goes, young, Albert dies, old. Not true at all. She had problems with her knee. She'd fallen over and smashed her knee at one point, and therefore she walked with a stick. And by the late 1890s, she did have cataracts, which meant that she struggled to see. But she was not an invalid. She was quite sprightly. Well into the 1890s, she was still able to dance a Highland jig, much to her courtiers' annoyance. She remained excited by food. One of her ladies-in-waiting, her parents owned a farm in Ledbury, and Victoria was constantly asking her to supply new things she hadn't eaten. Cider, perry, enormous apples that she would sit and eat on her own, new varieties of things, beautiful grapes. On one occasion in 1885, the International Health Exhibition was on in London, and there were Chinese cooks preparing meals as part of it. When Victoria got wind of it, she had them brought to Windsor to cook her a Chinese meal. This in an era when Chinese food was really only seen in Limehouse and other areas by ports. She said that she found the bird's nest soup to be particularly good. This was so right up to the end of her life. Even in the 1890s, even in 1899 and in 1900, when she was clearly dying, what she laments is the fact that she's lost her appetite. And that is the point when you know she's dying as well. As with William IV, you can read the Queen's life to some extent in her ledgers, although by this point they are few and far between. You can also read them in her own words. She complains about her lack of appetite, and it's very clear that when her appetite goes, she knows what's coming. She's well aware that she's going to die. She's well aware that her life is ending, and she doesn't want it to. She says at one point that although when the prince died, she wanted to die desperately, now she feels there's more to do, and she doesn't want to go yet. And she fights all the way to the end. Even right up to her dying breath, she is constantly making a recovery. The very last day, the day she dies, her family are summoned in the morning to stand around her deathbed. And then they have to go away because she needs a wee. And she has a glass of milk and signs some letters. And then they come back again because she's going to die. And she doesn't. So they ask the Archbishop of Canterbury to stop saying prayers because it's getting a bit boring. And then finally she does die. And it's almost a complete anticlimax when you're reading her doctor's letters and she's finally gone. And the nation doesn't know what to do. This, by the way, is the size of her when she was older. She dies. There's mourning. She gets a white funeral. She says that black is depressing, so everything should be white. And it snows on the day of the funeral, so it really is white. And it's the end of an age, and no one really knows what's coming next. And really, what comes next, in the shape of Bertie, is Victoria to the power of 10. Bertie has a very love-hate relationship with his mother. His mother doesn't really like Bertie, but they have a great deal in common. Bertie is a glutton and a gourmand like his mother, but it's acceptable to eat like a king. But if I tell you that someone ate like a queen, you think very differently about what that means. Bertie ate himself into an early grave, throwing himself into work and food with equal gusto. Fat, disgusting, lecherous, known as Tum Tum and Edward the Caresser, he turned out to be a brilliant monarch. But I think he has a lot more in common with Victoria than he would have wanted to actually admit to. She's a bit of a hero to me. Ignore her politics. Ignore the conflicting messages about motherhood. Ignore the fact that she'd clearly become a bit of an old bat to her household in old age. And celebrate the fact that she ate for her country. She ate curry cooked by her Indian cooks, or the cook to her Indian servants, I should say. She ate Chinese food before almost anyone else had tasted it. She constantly explored new flavours and tastes throughout her reign, and she ate a lot of them. In an age where food was constantly changing and where our diets changed almost out of all belief from the beginning to the end, she ate all of that, and then she ate some more. Now, we don't like greedy people these days. The Daily Mail and other horrendous newspapers of that ilk like to fat-shame people. I've been told that this will go down very well with some readers of some newspapers because historic fat-shaming is in. Yeah, she was huge. So what? Her husband died when she was in her 40s. If she wanted to eat, my God, she was queen. Who are we to sit and judge her for the fact that her knickers were enormous by the end of her life? It didn't seem to affect her health. She did have a prolapsed hernia and various other problems by the time she died, but she was into her 80s. I think we should salute her. Not necessarily follow completely in her footsteps. I wouldn't advise that you eat endangered birds, or quite as much as she ate. But I think we can celebrate the spirit of the Victorian period, and there's so many different spirits to choose from. But in this case, we can celebrate the spirit of the Victorian period, as exemplified by Victoria, by drinking a glass of claret mixed with whiskey, and pushing ourselves to try new flavours and embrace the fact that British food is every food, and loving everything we eat. Thank you very much.
At the end of Castle Lectures, I really feel I have nothing to say. But listening to this as a performance and as a delivery and the racing pace of what you covered in this short period of time, it was absolutely astonishing. And I found it fascinating from the first sentence to the last sentence. And as I said in my earlier remarks, I love the way you described this lecture and in your delivery and in the content. And I'm sure the audience has lots of questions. So, do you mind standing there?
No, totally.
Yes.
If I sit down, no one will see me.
Yes. Just say who you are and short questions.
Thanks very much. Matthew David from here in Durham. Given that England has had 8 monarchs named after potatoes, Edward the Eighth, King Edward the Second, King Edward, etc. Anyway, and given the catalogue that you provided of gout-bloated sort of leaders that preceded Victoria and followed from her, is Victoria special, or is she just another sponge?
She's just another sponge. She's special in that during her reign, the power of the monarchy did change, partly because of this long period where she just refused to see anyone. So popular perceptions of the monarchy changed. In terms of the fact that should we have a monarchy, should we not have a monarchy, those are wider issues. Between her and Edward, I would say they changed perceptions of the monarchy and changed what it meant. So up to Victoria, the monarch was very involved, was very much a political figure. By the end of Victoria's reign, and even more moving into Bertie's reign, it was more about ceremony. Her funeral was huge, people turning out on the streets. Her jubilees, 2 jubilees within the space of 10 years, big ones too, 87 and 97, thousands of people feeding on beef and plum pudding, celebrating the Queen's reign. So I think the big thing about Victoria is that she changed perceptions of the monarchy from hideous, foul people who did lots of political things and lost America to quite a benign thing that we all turn out on the streets and wave flags around. And that is, let's face it, largely what monarchy means today. We have forgotten that the monarch is the third house and that should she wish to behave like Trump, she could sign executive orders too, in theory.
Hello, I'm William Ault from Durham. The Victorians were quite well known for their interest in spas, health spas, Royal Leamington Spa, Harrogate and so on. Did you come across any evidence that that was mirrored in Queen Victoria's diet, i.e. healthy eating in inverted commas?
No. Bertie was very into spas, so even during Victoria's life, Bertie often went off to spas, although part of that was because it was very easy for him to meet women of slightly loose morals. He didn't tend to sleep with prostitutes. Bertie tended to sleep with the wives of other aristocrats who wouldn't have venereal diseases. So he liked spas from that point of view, although it wasn't really so much about the health aspect. From Victoria's point of view, health didn't really play a role. Towards the end of her life, she was constantly being asked to slow down and to reduce what she ate. She was offered Benger's salt, Benger's I think is how you pronounce it, or Benger's, which was an indigestion remedy, and she was advised to take that instead of one of her meals, possibly luncheon, and she just tried it and liked it and added it to the meals. She was a hypochondriac. She was constantly worried, certainly by the end of her life, about her health, and used to write sort of anguished letters to her doctors saying that she was definitely having a heart attack, completely having a heart attack. And the doctors would confer with each other and say it's probably just trapped wind. And it usually did turn out to be trapped wind. So she worried about her own health, but she never seemed to do anything with her diet to do anything. Likewise, exercise. When she was younger, she loved riding and used to tramp across the countryside for miles and miles and miles. But she did that because she enjoyed it. She didn't really do it because she felt that the health benefits were there. There's been a lot of stuff talked about the fact that anorexia and various other eating disorders have their roots in the Victorian era, something I don't believe. It's very clear that Victoria was verging on that when she was a teenager. So I would say that, if someone is so clearly verging on that when they're a teenager before their reign starts, how can it be a product of the Victorian age when it's not Victorian yet? So she had an odd relationship with food, but it wasn't health-driven. She did not breastfeed them. She refused to, despite the fact she'd been breastfed. And she the first child she was very worried over, Vicky, the Princess Royal. She was the woman in charge of the nursery, said she clucked, and she was just like sort of any new mother. She and Albert had their first massive row over feeding Vicky, the youngest child. Victoria shouted she wished she'd never married Albert and stormed out of the room, and he wrote her letters recriminating her. And then she burst into tears, and then, it was all just revolting. But certainly they tried feeding Vicky ass's milk and all sorts of bits and pieces, and she had too rich a diet. But they largely left it, really, to their nurses and their nursemaids and the governesses. So they had a fairly sort of typical upbringing in that they were weaned at 6 months onto, again, it was bread and milk, but also things like chicken and rice. And girls especially were fed very plain food because it was felt that otherwise it would excite their appetites and they would become too masculine, too interested in sex as they grew older. And even with boys, Bertie at one point was put on a sort of really stringent diet because it was quite clear he was a tearaway. They were terrible to Bertie, actually, in retrospect. They treated him very badly. And, just like his mother, they used to put him on diets and he used to find ways around it because he loved his food. So it was a fairly typical Victorian child's upbringing for most of the children. Beatrice, the youngest one, was slightly different. She used to get to come and sit downstairs and have pudding off people's plates and behave very badly.
Hi, Alexis Cleveland from Durham City. You've done all this research on all the recipes in there. How many, if any, recipes have you taken into your dinner party repertoire?
Quite a few. The Brussels biscuits are amazing. Well, no. Do you know what? I do like Brussels sprouts and artichokes, but there's a limit. Not on a school night is all I'd say. The Brussels biscuits, which she talks about, I love. There are recipes in the book just for the chapter headings, really, to give people a flavour of how they're written as well. And I've cooked all of the ones in the book, of which the Brussels biscuits, I would say, are the real winner. But in the wider way, a lot of I'm familiar with Victorian recipes anyway, and one of my absolute favourites is a Victorian recipe, which would not have been eaten by the Queen. It's a very middle-class recipe for sausages and chestnuts in a stew, which if you want to do is just get loads of butter, fry chopped sausages, any sausage will do, from beef sausage to bratwurst to whatever, fry them off, throw in a load of chestnuts, get the good ones, don't get the ones in the box, get the ones in the tin. Just sort of hit them a bit so that there's loads of them. Give them a bit more of a fry. Throw in a load of good chicken stock. Throw in a load of Madeira or possibly another fortified liqueur. Ginger wine works. Put a lid on it. Simmer it down for 20 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever you want. Scrape the bottom off because there's really good gooey goodness in there. Throw in a load of cayenne pepper, chopped parsley and some cream. Serve it. That is one of my go-to dishes. It's so easy, and it's one of those things you return to again and again and again. I think a lot of the flavours at this point are very well balanced and very interesting, and middle-class food actually is very, very good. Where it gets bad is towards the end of the period where you start to get a sort of culinary kitsch among the aspirational middle classes, the upper middle classes, and that's when you start to get things like you can't serve a tongue anymore. You have to chop up rabbit and veal and chicken and pork and mince them and put them through a sieve and then mix them with aspic and then put them into a tongue mould and serve that. And you think, but why don't you just serve the tongue? And woodcock I would avoid. Sorry, it's just so strong, especially the guts on toast. But a lot of the dishes are very, very nice indeed. And at the level of cooking for the Queen, they're stupendous, although they do take, a lot of the time, a very long time to cook. Sorry, I'm waiting for the man with the microphone to run round.
Hi, I'm Sophie Ridley. I'm at Durham University. You were talking about the children cooking in Swiss Cottage. It feels a bit like playing house, but for the royal children, that seems quite unusual. Is it kind of playing at what the rest of the country would be doing for house? Or they must have had some understanding of cooking and food at that level.
It is. I mean, in some ways, it's very unusual. It's not hyper unusual in that Fedora, Victoria's half-sister, also has a Swiss cottage for her children to cook in. But she's obviously not at the level of Queen of Great Britain. She's a minor German duchess. The setup of it is, I think, designed to teach them about the real world. Not because they will ever be cooking, but because they will be in charge of households of their own, to some extent countries of their own, and therefore it is deemed useful for them to know about the domestic economy. So Albert is behind the gardens that they set up. They have those set up before the cottage itself, 53 those go in. And he gives them market price for their vegetables. So they have to grow the best vegetables, and they're helped by the gardener. They grow the best vegetables, they sell them onto Albert. They have a miniature grocer's shop, which has everything marked up with price, beautiful. Sprat grocers to royalty. And everything's in there perfectly, macaroni and tapioca and lots of Victorian ingredients, all of them marked up. There's even a little toy range for the children that are too young and too small to be able to reach the ranges. And Victoria seems to have kept a cookery book of her own from 1832. Not necessarily recipes she'd cooked, more recipes she got from other places. So, you know, she's got one in there that's a hare soup that she was given to her by William IV, who certainly had a lot of hare soup, so it seems that it's probably true. And there was a manuscript book of recipes in the kitchen at Swiss Cottage, which may have been hers. So there is, to some extent, a certain level of transmission of recipes. But it seems to be more about the fact that these children will go on to be movers and shakers. They need to know the nitty-gritty and they need to be grounded. And of course, most of them do go on to marry into royalty. Or even if it's fairly minor royalty, there's only a couple that marry mere aristocrats. But even then, you're still in charge of a household. And a lot of the prevailing dialogue at the time is about how even if you are a woman and you are in the house and that is your economy, that is not someone who doesn't get their hands dirty. The whole concept of the domestic angel doesn't exist. You might be domestic, but you're hiring and firing servants, you're in charge of the body of the house, you're in charge of bringing up children to go out and die for the empire. So as a woman, you've got enormous responsibility. So whether you're a woman or whether you're one of the boys, they have a toy fort as well, so there's lots of martial activities too. It's really important that you know what other people are doing, what your subjects are doing, so that you've got an understanding. And it's one of the curiosities of them. They love doing it. Princess Royal, when she goes across and marries into Germany, marries Prussia, she sets up her own dairy, and she writes back to her mother and says, they don't know how to make milk here. They're not using the right cream settling pans. And they send each other vegetables from their own kitchen gardens and comment on the growing techniques. So they're clearly, both of them, very involved. And Victoria tours the kitchen gardens at Windsor, not just to have a look, but she writes in her journals before state visits that she went out to inspect the apricots and decided with the gardener they weren't ready yet. So there is a level of involvement there, which in some ways is quite surprising, but in other ways actually is quite sort of normal if you look at country houses and the way in which châtelaines worked there.
Harry Twining, University of Durham. Why do you feel that Queen Victoria has such a sober reputation, despite her, at the time, love of partying and eating and so forth, but we all sort of remember we are not amused, very, well, Victorian, as it were?
I think it's partly because a lot of the sources about her, the primary sources, were written in the latter years of her reign, where she'd already become almost deified. You couldn't write anything bad about her. I mean, even within just the culinary sphere, the number of times you hear that Victoria only ate a boiled egg for breakfast. Well, clearly not. I mean, her menus are there. She's not eating a boiled egg, she's eating sausages and beef steaks and mutton. Or you'll hear that she picked at her food like a bird. Again, absolute rubbish. But the sources published in her lifetime, there's a banned book in 1897 called The Private Life of the Queen. That's been used a lot as a source book. And that's very flattering. It's very sort of Hello magazine. The memoirs of her ladies in waiting came out much later in the 60s. So a lot of what we think of as Victoria is because of the writings in the 20s and 30s. And you've got people like Lytton Strachey like that as well. The revisionist history where you want to reject the Victorians because you're the new age. And therefore you have to paint the Victorians in a bad light and Victoria in the worst light possible because she defines Victorian. Because you can't possibly admit. I mean, the We Are Not Amused story has its roots in an anecdote where she did apparently tell someone to shut up because he was telling stories that were not entirely suitable. But you read her ladies-in-waiting's diaries, it's quite clear, she's shaking with laughter. We had a very amusing ladies' dinner. She's got a really wicked sense of humour. And, there are all sorts, things that we wouldn't find particularly funny today because we're used to a slightly more ribald sense of humour, I think. Stuff about turning up. There's an anecdote about somebody at dinner who turns up and he's talking about his sister and somebody else is talking about a boat. And at some point somebody says, well, we turned her over and scraped her bottom. And of course everyone gets the wrong end of the stick. And it's absolutely hilarious. And the Queen is shaking with laughter. There's a comedian that turns up at one point and does an impression of her. Well, she asks him to because she's heard that he does an impression. And he says, no, absolutely not. And she says, no, go on, you need to. And he goes, no. She goes, no, you do. So he does it. And afterwards she stares at him. And apparently the whole room went, oh, God. And then she slowly started to shake and shake and shake. So there were tears running down her face. And afterwards she said, that was very, very clever and very, very funny. And you must promise me never to do it again. So I always think of her as Queenie in Blackadder, which is probably the wrong way to think of her. But a lot of it is about people defining themselves in opposition to what came before. So if you're in the 20s, you define yourself in opposition to Victoria. And of course, it's very, very hard once she takes hold, especially as the widow of Windsor, to then combat this view. And even today, the knickers, the notorious knickers that come up for sale from time to time for £35,000 or whatever they are, even today I've taken part in historic online courses where people have been outraged that someone would put a picture of Queen Victoria's knickers. We're fat-shaming. This is disgusting. I can't believe we're doing this. So it's still hard to get enough distance to say, no, it's okay to study someone fairly dispassionately, to be interested in her personal life, to try and find a new perspective, to try and combat those myths, because in doing so, we gain a new perspective on ourselves, which is, of course, ultimately what the historian's role is, or one of them.
I'm Chip Tucker. I'm 5'10", and I'm visiting from Virginia. Queen Victoria quickly became a fixture in celebrity culture of a kind of new kind in her century, which impinged on commodity culture, another development of the century. And I've seen ads of the Queen's face for Pear's soap that date from the latter part of the 19th century. Did she get associated with any foods in the market in that way? Was she used to brand bacon or something?
There were foods associated with her indirectly. The latter part of the 19th century, as you rightly say, is very much about, well, you get commodities all the way through, but processed food products really boom in the 1870s and 1880s. And a lot of people are very canny about how they market their products. The first shipment of frozen beef, which comes across from Argentina, they send her one of the joints. To me, it's a really risky thing to do because it wasn't very well frozen. It was at 0 for the voyage. Food hygienists going, oh my God. But they sent her the beef and she pronounced it very nice. So they were able to say, well, this has been sent to the Queen of England. They also sent one to Bertie as well. The same with canned meat. Things are being sent to her to try. And there are certain sauces, especially. There's a sauce called Osborne sauce, which comes out, which is by the chemist to Her Majesty's establishment. So there's lots of things like that which are a bit tangential. And you get dishes named after her. So the most obvious one is Victoria Sponge. The sponge cake exists well before Victoria's reign. But that particular form, the Victoria sandwich, the Victoria sponge, is obviously named after her. And you get a lot of cookbook writers call their recipes after various children. Most of them haven't survived. So there's a writer called Agnes Marshall in the 1880s who is quite a notorious puffer of her own goods. She holds lots of patents. She's absolutely brilliant. And she has things like little cakes a la Beatrice, and various things a la Louise. And Francatelli does the same thing. So despite getting sacked, all of his books say, cook to Queen Victoria. And he has lots of recipes in there for soup a la Reine, or this a la Windsor, that kind of thing. So there are soups that do get associated with her, but they shouldn't be, if that makes sense. She doesn't endorse them as such. Obviously, if you've got a royal warrant, it's slightly different. So there are lots of companies that possess royal warrants, which is the right to supply the court. And they are renewed, they pay for them, but they're renewed, they're still royal warrants, they're renewed every year. So those suppliers that genuinely do supply the court have the right to say supplier to Her Majesty, and that does get used, and used a lot. and they will really go to town on that. Royal crests on everything. So that is certainly something that gets used. But as you say, her face does appear an awful lot, and she can't really sue them all at that point. But she is a phenomenon from that point of view.
I'm Michael Singh, a student here at the university. I'd like to ask, given her diet and the standard of food health and safety standards at the time, how important were doctors for, I guess, the survival of Queen Victoria to her old age?
She was blessed with the constitution of an ox. There are certainly things that should have killed her, like that shipment of frozen beef. To be honest, well dodgy. She always had doctors on call. She always had doctors in her household, and they were very important. But to some extent, their importance was because she suffered from such bad hypochondria. Her last doctor, Dr. Reed, was very important in her life. He sort of replaced John Brown and Prince Albert as the main man she came to rely on, and worked as an intermediary, really, between the household and herself. So they were important, but medicine at the time was not. You couldn't administer antibiotics and penicillin and various other drugs. So there's a limit to what they can do. They were important in other ways, though. I mean, the 9 children she had, clearly if there had been major complications, there would have been problems. But the last 2, if not 3, she had chloroform for. And Victoria wasn't exactly a massive proponent of women's rights. But by having chloroform for the last 3 children, she did make an enormous change to how women gave birth. Because at that point, it was seen that if you had chloroform as a woman, it was a terrible thing to do. It was unbiblical. You were denying yourself the pain of childbirth. You wouldn't be able to bond with your child. It was Eve's punishment for having Adam thrown out of the Garden of Eden, that women should have to go through pain of childbirth. All this absolute baloney. And the Queen just basically said, well, go do one. I'm having chloroform. And in doing so, that was like a huge move forward for women, quite frankly. But otherwise, I'm not sure the doctors could have done much to save her. I mean, they pretty much administered beef tea, and that was about the limit of their usefulness a lot of the time. She did have gout, inevitably, and she also had an abscess at one point that needed lancing. I mean, she was in a lot of pain from that. And again, at that point, suddenly in her journals, food bubbles up as a real preoccupation because she can't use a knife and fork because she can't use her arm. So she has to be fed by her daughter. And the level of revulsion that she feels at not being able to eat with her own knife and fork is quite obvious. So they were around to do things like lance boils and look after her gout and bandage her. But mainly they were there, I think, for her mental health as much as anything. And that was a much, much bigger concern when it came to Victoria. Sort of. I mean, shall I do them in order? No, question number okay.
2. How different was the royal eating regime from other royalties in Europe? I mean, how different was it to the French, the Spanish, and so on? And thirdly, and this is a more political question, whilst all this is going on, Karl Marx is writing in the British Museum. The working classes are rising, the trade unions realizing, struggles beginning for the franchise and so on, empire is beginning to come under pressure. And she's eating for England, so at some point there must be huge, she's popular, people, somewhere there must be a disjuncture, a set of contradictions which burst into the public imagination.
Right. Now, number 1 and 2 are sort of linked, in that the prevailing cuisine of Europe is French. Still is. Haute cuisine is French. So her head chefs were often French, and there were a lot of French working in her kitchens. And that was similar across Europe. There were differences. In Germany, for example, they had breakfast at sort of 9 o'clock, and then they had their dinner at about 4 or 5. Whereas in England, we'd had breakfast, lunch, and then dinner at about 8 o'clock. So there were differences in meal patterns, but the dinners were roughly speaking the same. And when she goes on state visits, she knows how to behave, and likewise, people coming across know how to behave, because those norms at dinner are roughly the same. Most of her cooks were English, and most of them were recruited through the royal household links already. So some of them had French or Swiss or German parents, but the parents worked in the royal household and the children were usually born in Britain. Her confectionery chefs were usually Italian. Because the Italians had a reputation as being the best confectioners, but they were usually recruited through one of the big confectionery firms, so Gunter's, Ward's, Bridgman's. There are big professional confectionery houses, caterers. Some are Swiss. Again, that would be because she's got Swiss people working in the household. Gabrielle Schumi, who I mentioned as going wow at the kitchens, was Swiss. And her bakers were often German, which again was fairly normal in Britain. There were lots of German bakers who had fled Prussian oppression during the 60s and 70s and come across to Britain. So there was quite a mixture, but most of them were British. Then at the end of her life, for her jubilee, she had Indian servants brought across in 1887. They came with their own cook, who cooked for them exclusively, but that cook also cooked a fish curry and chicken curry for her every week for about a few months in the 1880s, and then occasionally thereafter. So there was a fair range of nationalities. Everyone hated the Indians, partly through racism, partly through linguistic barriers, and partly because the munchie who was in charge of the household was quite a nasty piece of work and had gonorrhea, and that was felt not to be the right thing to do in the royal household. So for the second question, which I've sort of answered anyway, it was roughly similar. In terms of popularity and in terms of the movements, she's quite an interesting figure. At various points, she suddenly becomes very aware of the plight of the poor. And at one point, she writes to her eldest daughter and says that the working classes... She essentially says she can't believe the working classes are still not rising up against them because really they're all oppressed. But when she's younger, when she's a teenager, she falls for this family of gypsies and becomes very entranced with this travelling family and goes out and gives them blankets and food. And for a while, it almost looks like she's going to develop a social conscience. And then she doesn't, because Lord Melbourne tells her not to worry about the poor because they're always going to be poor and she shouldn't worry too much about it. But she does at various points do things within her own remit to try and help them. So there are various balls that are held. Notoriously, there's a ball held in aid of the Spitalfield silk workers who are all struggling with mechanisation coming in, where she wears a stomacher worth £60,000. If she just sort of sold that, it would have raised quite a lot more than the ball. And eventually she gets involved in the plight of the Irish during the Irish potato famine as well, and gives money to various causes. But in the main, she doesn't bother herself about it. And when she's in seclusion in the 1860s, there is a genuine movement to overthrow the monarchy. There is a huge underground Republican movement. But somebody puts a sign on the Buckingham Palace gate saying, "For sale, unwanted, owner, gone away." And she's at Balmoral all the time, and she is told, come out of retirement. You will not survive. The monarchy won't survive this. So there is a movement, and she does not help it. And eventually she has to come out of retirement because government won't grant her any money to get her children married off unless she turns up at Parliament and opens Parliament. And they make that a condition, that if she doesn't come and open Parliament and be seen in public so that the people can see they have a monarch. And she's categorically told the only thing that makes a monarch is the fact that people allow you to be the monarch. If you do not come out and show yourself and give people the monarchy, it doesn't matter if you're a monarch or not, because you won't be for very long. So there is a movement, and she survives by the skin of her teeth, to be honest. In some ways, if she died in the 70s and Bertie had become king at that point, we could have a very, very different political landscape because he was much more engaged. But it is quite interesting as she sat there and sort of solidly munched her way through everything that moved, and the country sort of burnt beneath her.
Andy, thank you. I mean, first of all, for me, it's just an incredible performance that you give. I mean, it's just breathtaking to listen to you, totally engaging, enormously enlivening and informative. And secondly, I mean, just the range of your narratives, the work you've done, that you present with such ease, obviously, years to put together to bring this all. And thank you on behalf of everyone here. Great luck with this book, which I'm sure is going to be a huge success, with a title like that and a cover like that and an author like you. I'm also a publisher in other parts of my life, and let me tell you, this is a package we would have loved. Congratulations and good luck with it.
Thank you.